I submitted my transfer application on a Thursday night. 5 days earlier, Marcus Webb had already written down where I was going. I didn't know that yet. On the Thursday, I was sitting at my kitchen table at 11:40 p.m., filling out the Ohio Department of Mental Health's internal transfer portal on my laptop. My daughter's mother had texted me the finalized custody schedule an hour before. She was moving to Dayton. If I wanted my weekends, the weekends we'd spent 8 months and 2 mediators negotiating, I needed to be within driving distance. Cora was 6. She didn't understand what a custody schedule was, but she understood that some weekends I showed up and some I didn't, and she was starting to count. I selected Ridgemont Residential Center as my first choice, confirmed my employee ID, and submitted. The portal is confidential. Supervisors aren't notified until an application clears the first administrative review, which takes 10 to 15 business days. I hadn't told anyone at Garfield State Residential Center, not Diane, not Jamie, not the union rep. I closed the laptop and tried to sleep. Garfield was a 90-bed state psychiatric residential facility about 40 minutes east of Columbus, set back from a county road in flat farmland that looked the same in every direction. Not an asylum from a movie, a functioning, underfunded, 1970s-built brick complex with fluorescent lighting, linoleum floors, and a maintenance backlog that would outlive everyone who worked there. I'd been a psychiatric care technician on the overnight shift for 4 years. PCT duties meant 15-minute patient checks, medication administration assistance, incident documentation, unit security rounds, and communication with nursing staff. We didn't make clinical decisions. We watched, recorded, and reported. The pay was $41,000 a year before the night differential, which is exactly enough to make you think carefully about your next move. 9 days after I submitted the application, I was doing a 2:15 a.m. check on the East Wing. The corridor was quiet except for the low cycling of the HVAC system, which had a faint rattle near the ceiling vent outside room 4 that maintenance had been looking into for 11 months. Most long-term residents sleep through the night. The medication schedules are designed that way. I moved through the hall with my flashlight angled low, checking through the reinforced window in each door. Room 6 was Marcus Webb's, 61 years old, admitted 11 years ago following a psychotic break during which he'd walked into a county courthouse and calmly told the clerk the building would flood in 3 days. It flooded in 4. A pipe failure in the basement, not weather, but by then, Marcus had already been placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold. Diagnosis: schizoaffective disorder, stable on medication, no behavioral incidents in the last 3 years. Cooperative, polite in a distant way, never agitated during checks. His therapeutic program included journaling, so he kept composition notebooks, the standard black and white marbled kind, stacked on the small desk the facility provided. He filled them slowly and methodically, and his treatment team considered it a positive sign of cognitive engagement. That night, Marcus was sitting up. Not unusual by itself, but he was at his desk with the lamp on, and one of his notebooks was open. He wasn't writing. He was looking at the page the way you'd look at a photograph of someone you hadn't seen in a long time. I tapped the window glass with one knuckle, the standard alert so patients know they've been observed and aren't being secretly surveilled. Marcus looked up, nodded once, and closed the notebook. I logged the check and moved on. 2 nights later, Diane Ostroff pulled me aside at the start of shift. Diane was the senior nurse on overnight, 52, 19 years at Garfield, the kind of woman who could run a triage during a power outage and still have her charting done before dawn. She didn't waste words, and she didn't repeat herself, so when she spoke, you listened the first time. "Patel wants to see you tomorrow before your shift," she said. 4 o'clock. About what? He didn't say, but he asked me whether you'd mentioned anything about a transfer. That stopped me. I haven't mentioned it to anyone. Diane gave me a look that wasn't suspicion and wasn't sympathy, something adjacent to both. Well, somebody mentioned it to him. I assumed the portal had flagged faster than expected, or that some administrative assistant had forwarded the notification early. Bureaucracies leak. I didn't think about it again until I was sitting across from Dr. Ashwin Patel the next afternoon. Patel was the clinical director, 45, careful with his words, the kind of administrator who could decline a request in a way that made you feel like you'd been done a favor. The meeting was brief and cordial. He asked about my reasons for the transfer, confirmed that my performance evaluations were strong, and said he'd support the application. Then he asked a question that seemed offhand but wasn't. "You're on the East Wing overnights, correct? How is Mr. Webb?" "Same as always. Quiet, compliant, writes in his notebooks." Patel nodded. "Have you read any of his writing?" "No, I wouldn't do that." "Good. The notebooks are part of his therapeutic program. The content is protected under his treatment plan. Staff shouldn't engage with it." Nobody had ever told me not to read a patient's journal before. We weren't in the habit of reading them anyway. We didn't have time, and most of the long-form writing patients produced was deeply personal or clinically incoherent. The instruction felt like putting a padlock on a door nobody had tried to open. I said I understood and left. On the drive home, I called Cora. She told me she'd learned how to write the letter Q, and that her friend Milo had a turtle. She asked when I was coming. I told her soon. I told her I was working on it. Jamie Aldridge was the one who brought it up first. Jamie worked the day shift, 28, 2 years at Garfield, still idealistic enough to eat lunch in the break room instead of his car, and still young enough to believe that the state cared about the people it warehoused. We overlapped during shift change, and he'd been asking me about the overnight routines. He was thinking about switching to nights for the differential pay. About a week after my meeting with Patel, Jamie caught me in the parking lot. "Weird question," he said. "Do you ever look at what Webb writes?" Patel told me not to. "Patel told you specifically?" "Yeah." "Why?" Jamie leaned against his car. "During rec time today, Webb left his notebook open on the table when he went to the bathroom. I wasn't trying to read it, but it was right there, and I saw my name. Your name, my full name, Jamie Aldridge, and next to it, a date, next Tuesday. And next to the date, it said overtime, Unit B, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. Did you check the schedule? That's the thing. I wasn't scheduled for Tuesday at all. I went to Connie in staffing after lunch to ask about next week, and she said they were short on Unit B and were going to call me about picking up the shift. She hadn't called yet. She said she'd only decided to fill the slot about an hour before I walked in. I told Jamie it was probably coincidence. Long-term patients hear more than we think. They pick up on staffing patterns, notice which units are short, learn the institutional rhythms. Marcus had been at Garfield for over a decade. He'd watched hundreds of staff come and go. It wasn't impossible that he'd gotten good at guessing. Jamie nodded, but the nod was mechanical. He had the exact time, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., not 7 to 3. Connie said she changed it from 7 to 3 at the last minute, because of an appointment one of the Unit B nurses had. I told him to leave it alone. That night, I did my rounds on the East Wing. The overhead fluorescents were dimmed to their overnight setting, casting the corridor in that flat, yellowish non-light that made everything look like it existed slightly outside of normal time. Marcus was asleep at the 1:30 check, asleep at 1:45, asleep at 2 o'clock. At 2:15, I turned the corner toward room 6 and stopped. Marcus was standing at his desk, facing the door. The notebook was closed. His hand rested flat on its cover. He was looking directly at the window, at the exact spot where my face would appear, before I reached it. He'd been waiting. I tapped the glass anyway. Standard procedure. Marcus held my gaze for 2 or 3 seconds, the way you'd look at someone you recognized at an airport, then sat down and turned off his lamp. I logged the check and moved to room 7. Outside room 9, the rattle in the ceiling vent was louder than usual. I made a note to submit another maintenance request in the morning, and I kept my pace steady, and I didn't let myself wonder how he'd known exactly when I'd be at that window. Working in a psychiatric facility teaches you a specific kind of discipline. Patients say unusual things. They describe elaborate systems and connections that don't exist outside their own neurology. You learn to focus on behavior, not content. Is the patient escalating? Are they a danger? Are they medication compliant? The substance of their beliefs is the treatment team's domain, not mine. So I told myself Marcus Webb's notebooks were a symptom. Organized, impressively detailed, but a symptom. I told myself that Patel's instruction was standard privacy protection. And for about 6 days, that worked. Then I found the cabinet. The records room at Garfield was a converted storage space in the basement. Metal shelving, filing cabinets, a desktop computer running software that predated half the staff. Active patient files lived upstairs in the clinical offices. Old treatment plans, outdated assessments, and administrative correspondence migrated down here when cabinet space ran out. I went to the records room maybe 10 times in 4 years, always for maintenance forms or incident report templates. I was there to pull a supply requisition form. The filing system used a category and year labeling convention, but someone had recently reorganized a section, and the drawer I needed was wrong. I moved down the back row checking labels, trying to reorient. One cabinet, second from the wall, had a label that was only a 7-digit number. No document category, no year, just the number. I recognized it because I entered it on the East Wing check-in sheet every night. Marcus Webb's patient ID. The cabinet should have been locked. Anything associated with a patient identifier is supposed to be secured, but the latch mechanism was the old push-button kind, and the button was jammed in the released position, corroded maybe, or just worn out from years of use. It looked like it had been that way for a while. Inside were 11 manila folders, each labeled with a date range spanning roughly a year. The folders were thick but didn't contain notebooks. They contained photocopies. Dozens and dozens of photocopied notebook pages, organized chronologically, each stamped with a received date in the upper right corner. Someone had been systematically copying Marcus's entries and filing them in the basement. I pulled a folder from roughly 3 years ago. The first page was Marcus's handwriting, the same measured, slightly cramped script I'd glimpsed through his window. March 17th, fire alarm test, 10 a.m. Wiring fault in Unit C panel. Test extended to 10:40. Brenda Kowalski will request early lunch for Unit C patients. Approved by Ostroff. Below it, in red ink that wasn't Marcus's handwriting, someone had written, confirmed. See incident log 0317. The next page. A plumbing repair in the East Wing bathroom. Date, time, the name of the maintenance contractor, the specific fixture. Below it, in the same red ink, confirmed. Minor discrepancy. Contractor arrived at 9:15, not 9 o'clock. I went through 6 more pages. Every entry was a prediction of an internal facility event. Staffing decisions, maintenance issues, supply deliveries, patient transfers between units, treatment team meeting outcomes, written days before the event occurred, and every entry had a red ink annotation confirming or noting minor deviations. The folder was full of them, so were the next 3 I checked. I closed the cabinet. Maintenance contractor names and arrival times. The outcomes of meetings held behind closed doors. The specific wording of a staffing approval. These weren't things a patient on the East Wing could learn through perception or pattern recognition, no matter how attentive he was over 11 years. Someone had been verifying Marcus's entries against actual events and annotating the results systematically for years. This wasn't a patient journaling as therapy. This was a monitoring operation, and the clinical director had looked me in the eye and told me not to read the notebooks. I waited 3 days before going back. I didn't want a visible pattern of visits. The records room had a sign-in log, and even if nobody checked it regularly, I wasn't going to be the person who visited the basement 4 times in 1 week when my average was twice a year. On the 3rd day, I went down during the records clerk's lunch. The most recent folder in Marcus's cabinet had an open date range. Still active, someone adding to it regularly. I turned to the entries from the past 2 weeks. The 4th page in, Eliot Marsh. Transfer application to Ridgemont Residential Center. Submitted, daughter Sevenol submitted. First choice facility. Reason, custody schedule. Daughter. Application will be supported by Patel. Transfer will be approved within 6 weeks. The date at the top of the entry was 5 days before I submitted the application. 5 days before my daughter's mother sent the text. 5 days before I'd made the decision or had any reason to make it. Below the entry, in red ink, confirmed. Application submitted. Matches. I put the folder back. I closed the cabinet. I walked upstairs and clocked out. Sitting in my car, I called Cora. She didn't answer. It was past her bedtime. I sat there for a while with the phone in my lap, looking at the brick face of the building, the lit windows of the units where the overnight staff were starting their rounds, my rounds, the job that was supposed to be temporary, that became 4 years, that was now the thing standing between me and my daughter's weekends. Marcus Webb had written down where I was going before I knew I was going. He'd written down why. He'd written down that it would be approved. And someone on the administrative staff had verified it, annotated it, and filed it in a basement cabinet without saying a word to me. I almost let it go. The transfer was being supported. My record was clean. Cora was counting weekends. But in the oldest folder I'd checked, there was a detail I couldn't stop turning over. The red ink annotations stopped abruptly in the middle of the date range. Mid-page, mid-year. The last annotated entry was followed by 15 or 20 unannotated pages. Then the annotations resumed in a different hand, smaller letters, more clinical abbreviations. Whoever had been doing the checking had been replaced. I asked Diane, carefully, whether anyone had left the overnight staff about 3 years ago. Tom Carlin, she said without hesitating. BCT, same position you have. East Wing for about 2 years. Why'd he leave? Transferred out. Somewhere downstate. Quick. 1 week he was here, next he was gone. Did he file anything before he left? About a patient? Diane straightened a stack of intake forms, aligned their edges, set them down. He filed an internal complaint. I never saw it. Rumor was it had something to do with documentation practices on the East Wing. Patel handled it directly. Tom was gone within 10 days. She paused. He used to carry red pens. Always had one in his shirt pocket. I thought it was a tic. That connected something. The first handwriting in the red annotations, larger, less clinical, could have been Carlin's. He hadn't just discovered the notebooks. He'd been the one checking them. Diane looked at me with the gaze of someone who had survived 19 years by knowing exactly which questions to stop asking. Eliot, how far along is your transfer? Patel said he'd support it. Then let him. Go get your weekends, and stop visiting the basement during Gloria's lunch break. She knew. Not everything, maybe, but the shape of it. Enough to know which doors stayed closed and what happened to the people who propped them open. Jamie found me the next day during shift change. He was pale and speaking too fast to sound casual. I need to show you something. Not here. We drove to a gas station 2 miles from the facility. Jamie had his phone out before I'd turned off the engine. I took a picture. I know I shouldn't have. But Webb left his notebook open during group and he showed me the screen. Marcus's handwriting. An entry dated 4 days from now. Unit B, Room 12. Patient, David Yeager. Respiratory distress, unrelated to current medication. Approximately 3:45 a.m. Staff will follow code protocol. Equipment cart in current position will add delay. Yeager will be stabilized. Transfer to St. Anne's. Incident report filed by Marsh. That's your unit, Jamie said. Yeager is real. Room 12. David Yeager, 67. Major depressive disorder with psychotic features. History of COPT, poorly managed before admission. Stable, but stable in a state facility meant one bad night away from a crisis. The equipment cart, I said. Where is it now? They moved it last week. Used to be right outside room 12. Now it's down by the nurse's station. Clearance issue with a wheelchair patient. 90 seconds farther, minimum. I sat with my hands on the steering wheel, watching a woman at the gas pump argue with her card reader, and I made a decision that had nothing to do with Marcus Webb's notebooks and everything to do with the fact that if a patient on my unit went into respiratory distress, I wanted the cart where it should be. I'll move it tonight. What about the rest? Should we report? Not yet. Let's see what happens. Jamie stared at his phone for a long time, then put it in his pocket. Neither of us mentioned Cora or the transfer. He didn't need to know that the reason I wasn't going to report anything right now was a 6-year-old who needed me employed and geographically available. I moved the equipment cart during my shift that night, back to the alcove outside room 12, where it had lived for 2 years before the change. If anyone asked, the current location was a clearance hazard for the wheelchair patient on the north corridor. Documentable, reasonable. I confirmed the oxygen supplies, the bag valve mask, the suction equipment. Standard checks I performed every shift, but this time I went through the inventory twice and tested the flow valve on the portable oxygen tank. The next 3 nights were uneventful. Marcus was asleep every time I passed room 6. Lamp off, notebook closed. Outside, a late spring storm system moved through on the second night, and the wind drove rain against the east wing windows hard enough that several patients woke up during the wanna-get-'em round. I spent an extra 20 minutes doing comfort checks, normal work. The kind of work that reminds you why the job matters, even when the pay doesn't. On the fourth night, the date Marcus had written, I started my shift at 11 p.m. I checked the cart, still in position. I went through my rounds. At 3:38 a.m., I was doing a check on room 8 when I heard a sound from down the corridor. A wheeze, then a stuttering cough, then nothing. I was at room 12 in seconds. Through the window, David Yeager was sitting up in bed, one hand on his chest, mouth open. His lips had a bluish tint visible even in the dim room light. I opened the door and hit the emergency call button simultaneously. The cart was 8 feet away. I had it inside the room and was pulling the oxygen mask free when Diane came around the corner at a pace that looked calm but covered ground fast. She took over the oxygen while I positioned Yeager upright to ease his breathing. By the time the on-call physician arrived, his color was improving and his oxygen saturation was climbing back toward a number that let you exhale. The physician ordered a transfer to St. Anne's Medical Center for observation and imaging. Yeager left by ambulance at 4:50 a.m. I filed the incident report. I noted the equipment cart's position. I noted the response time. Marcus had written approximately 3:45 a.m. The event logged at 3:38, 7 minutes off. The patient, the room, the type of distress, the outcome, the receiving hospital, the name on the incident report, all exact. The time was close, not perfect. I didn't know whether that made it more or less troubling. A perfect prediction would have felt like a magic trick, something performed. An approximate one felt like Marcus was describing something he could see but not quite bring fully into focus, the way you'd describe a scene through frosted glass. I did not note in the report why the cart had been moved, or that a patient in a separate wing had described this event in a notebook 4 days before it happened. Patel called me in the following afternoon. He was standing when I entered his office, which was unusual. He normally sat behind his desk, a man who used furniture the way other people use distance. Good work last night, he said. The response on Yeager was well handled. Thank you. I see you moved the equipment cart back to the room 12 alcove. The current position was Eliot. He said my name the way you'd set down something fragile. The records room has a sign-in log. You signed it 3 times in 2 weeks. Your annual average before this month was 2 visits per year. Gloria mentioned it to me, so that was how he knew. Not supernatural, not Marcus. A records clerk who noticed a name appearing too often and mentioned it to her boss. How much have you seen? Patel asked. The photocopies, the red annotations, my transfer entry. Patel walked to his window. When he spoke, he didn't turn around. The monitoring was in place before I arrived. My predecessor, Dr. Brose, started it after Webb's 3rd year. She tried to get an outside evaluation. The state declined. So she built the documentation protocol. Copy, verify, file, keep it internal. For 11 years. What would you do with it? He turned around. What agency handles this? What form covers it? If we reported it, we'd lose accreditation. The facility would be reviewed. 87 patients would be displaced. Staff would lose their jobs. And Marcus Webb would be transferred somewhere that doesn't understand the situation, where the documentation stops, and whatever this is continues without anyone watching. He waited. I didn't have an answer, and he knew I didn't have an answer, because there wasn't one. Tom Carlin, I said. Carlin read the notebooks directly. He confronted Marcus about the content. Marcus became agitated, first time in years. We had to adjust his medication. Carlin filed an internal complaint. It was reviewed and closed because there's no clinical framework for what he was alleging. He accepted a transfer. Did he accept it, or did you arrange it? Both. Patel reached into his desk drawer and placed a single photocopied page on the desk between us, the same way yours is being arranged. Marcus's handwriting. Dated 2 days from now. Marsh will request access to Notebook 11. He will be denied. He will not push further. His transfer will process. He will leave Garfield on Don. He will not speak about Room 6 publicly. Below the entry, in Patel's precise handwriting, pending. This entry wasn't a prediction of a facility event. It was a prediction of what I would choose. It was telling me, specifically, how I would behave, including the decision to stop. Notebook 11 is the current volume, Patel said quietly. It's in my office safe. You can request access. I'll deny the request per the treatment plan protocol. What happens after that is your decision. He sat down. I looked at the page for a long time. Then I looked at the framed photo on Patel's bookshelf. His daughter, maybe 8 or 9, holding a soccer ball. He saw me notice it. Neither of us said anything else. I drove home with the windows down. The air smelled like cut grass and diesel from the county road. Marcus had written what I would do, and Patel had shown it to me. And now I was supposed to either fulfill the prediction or defy it. If I didn't request the notebook, the entry was wrong, or I was complying by a different route. If I requested it and accepted the denial, the entry was correct down to the letter. If I pushed further, I was choosing something Marcus hadn't written, and the next page might say anything. I thought about Cora, the apartment in Dayton I'd found online, 2 bedrooms, a park within walking distance, a school district that wasn't great, but wasn't failing. I thought about weekends, pancake mornings, the specific weight of a 6-year-old who falls asleep on your shoulder during a movie and doesn't notice when you carry her to bed. I thought about Tom Carlin, wherever he was, whether pushing had gotten him anything except distance from a place he couldn't explain. I thought about David Yeager, breathing on his own at St. Anne's. The next evening, I stopped at the nurse's station before my shift. Diane was charting. I need to submit a formal request for access to a patient's therapeutic materials, I said. Current notebook, Marcus Webb. Diane looked up. You know he'll say no. I know. But the request needs to exist. She held my gaze for a moment, then handed me the form. I filled it out, signed it, placed it in the clinical director's inbox. Patel denied the request the following morning. Patient privacy, therapeutic program integrity. Standard, clean, procedurally airtight. A form letter with his signature. I did not appeal. I did not file a complaint. I did not contact the state. Marcus had written that I wouldn't. Jamie deleted the photograph from his phone 3 days after Yeager's transfer. He told me Diane had talked to him. Not threatened, just talked. The way Diane talked, which was enough. After that, he stopped meeting me during shift change. If we passed in the parking lot, he'd nod and keep walking, keys already in his hand, and I understood that he'd decided to be someone who didn't know what he knew. I didn't blame him. He was 28. He didn't have a custody arrangement forcing him to calculate every risk against a weekend with his kid. My transfer was approved 11 days later. I finished my remaining shifts on the East Wing without incident. On my last night, I did my rounds the way I'd done them 1,000 times, room 1 through room 10. When I reached room 6, Marcus was awake. He was sitting at his desk, lamp on, notebook open. He was writing. His hand moved steadily across the page, the pen never pausing or lifting. Whatever he was putting down, he wasn't composing it, he was transcribing it, the way a court reporter captures speech they didn't generate. I tapped the glass. He looked up, and for the first time in the months I'd known him, he spoke to me through the door. His voice was muffled by the reinforced window, but I heard every word. You'll do fine in Dayton, Eliot. Cora's going to love the park. I hadn't told anyone about the park. I hadn't told anyone my daughter's name. Not Marcus, not Patel, not anyone at Garfield. Her name wasn't in my personnel file or my transfer application. It wasn't in any document the facility had access to. I logged the check. I finished the round. I turned in my badge and ID on my way out. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and called Cora's voicemail, the one her mother let her have on the family tablet, and I told her I'd see her soon. I told her we were going to check out a park near the new apartment. I told her I loved her. Then I started the car and drove home from Garfield State Residential Center for the last time. Ridgemont was a better facility, newer building, better staffing ratios, 16 minutes from Cora's school. I started on the day shift and settled into the routine within 2 weeks. The patients were different, the corridors were different, the coffee was the same institutional powder it is everywhere. Some weeks I didn't think about Garfield at all. Most weeks I thought about it once, usually late, usually when it was quiet, usually when I was checking the position of an equipment cart out of a habit I couldn't quite explain to anyone who asked. 3 months in, a padded envelope arrived in the facility's staff mailroom. My name, typed label, no return address. postmarked from the town where Garfield was located. Inside was a single composition notebook page, carefully removed along the perforated edge. The handwriting was not Marcus Webb's. It was smaller, neater, slanted slightly to the left. I had never seen it before. The entry was dated 9 days in the future. It described a specific event at Ridgemont, a patient name I recognized, a unit I worked on, a time in the early morning, a type of incident. My name appeared in the description of the response. There was no red ink annotation, no confirmed, no pending, no indication of who had written it, who had sent it, or how they knew where I worked. Just the entry, and below it, one additional line. Equipment cart, East Corridor, incorrect position. I put the page in my jacket pocket. I walked to the East Corridor of my unit. The emergency cart had been shifted. A custodian had moved it to make room for a floor buffer, still plugged into the wall outlet. The cart was sitting 15 feet from its assigned alcove, wedged between a supply shelf and a hand sanitizer dispenser. I unplugged the buffer, wheeled it aside, and rolled the cart back into position. 9 days later, at the time written on that page, a patient on my unit coded. The cart was where it needed to be. The patient survived. I never received another envelope. But every shift, before I do anything else, before I check the schedule, before I read the overnight notes, before I pour the bad coffee, I walk the corridor and I check every cart on the floor. Cora asked me once why I was always early to work. I told her I liked to make sure everything was where it was supposed to be. She said that sounded boring. She asked if she could have waffles. I told her she could have whatever she wanted.